The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and memories. I was rolling dough for the apple turnovers Lucas used to beg for as a child, my hands moving in the same rhythm they'd followed for 37 years of marriage. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching the gold of my wedding band as I worked. That simple circle that had witnessed every triumph, every heartbreak, every quiet Tuesday just like this one. I didn't hear him come in. Lucas had his own key, of course, though he rarely used it for visits anymore, only when he needed something. Mom. His voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to recognize, casual but urgent, like someone trying to sound relaxed while asking for a favor they know they shouldn't. I turned, wiping flour from my hands on the dish rag Henry had bought me years ago, the one with little sunflowers that had faded but never lost their charm. Lucas stood in my doorway looking older than his 34 years, his hair unkempt and his clothes wrinkled in a way that spoke of another sleepless night spent chasing dreams that required other people's money. "I made enough for you, too," I said, gesturing toward the turnovers cooling on the rack. "Your favorites." He didn't look at the pastries. His eyes darted around the kitchen, landing everywhere except on my face. That's nice, Mom. Actually, I need to talk to you about something." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. After Henry died 2 years ago, Lucas had become my closest family, my only child, the person I thought would help carry the weight of all these empty rooms. But lately, our conversations had become transactions. He needed money for a business opportunity. He needed help with rent. He needed understanding for why his latest venture hadn't worked out as planned. "What is it, sweetheart?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a gesture that reminded me so painfully of the little boy who used to confess to breaking my favorite vase or eating cookies before dinner. But this wasn't about childhood mischief. Something in his posture told me this was bigger, more serious, the kind of confession that changes things between people. I had an opportunity come up, a real opportunity this time, Mom. Something that could finally get me back on my feet. I waited, my hands still holding the dish rag, my heart already sinking, though I couldn't say why. Lucas had been chasing opportunities for years now, each one promising to be the answer to problems that seemed to multiply faster than solutions. "I needed some quick cash to make it happen," he continued, his voice gaining speed as if hurrying through the explanation would make it less painful. "Just temporary. I'll pay it back with interest. I promise." "Lucas, you know I don't have—" "I sold Dad's ring." The words hit me like cold water. I felt my breath catch, my hand instinctively moving to my left ring finger, where Henry's simple gold band should have been resting beside my own. But my finger was bare. I hadn't noticed. How had I not noticed? "You what?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "Mom, listen. I know it sounds bad, but think about it logically. Dad's gone. The ring was just sitting in your jewelry box, not helping anyone. At least this way, it's creating value. It's working toward something positive." I stared at my son, this man I had raised, fed, comforted through nightmares and heartbreak, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not break exactly, crack. Like ice on a pond when spring arrives, when the solid surface you've trusted all winter suddenly reveals its fragility. That wasn't just a ring, Lucas. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of impatience I'd seen too many times lately. "I know it meant something to you, but Dad wouldn't want it just sitting there gathering dust. He'd want it to help his family, right? He'd want it to help his son get ahead in life." The casual way he said it, gathering dust, as if 37 years of marriage, of Henry's hand reaching for mine in the dark, of the weight of that ring against my palm when I held it after the funeral, was nothing more than neglected inventory. "You took it without asking," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I knew you'd say no. You'd get emotional about it and miss the bigger picture. This is about the future, Mom. About me finally making something of myself instead of—" He gestured vaguely at my kitchen, at the turnovers cooling on the rack, at the life I'd built in this house where Henry and I had planned to grow old together. Instead of what? Instead of ending up stuck in the same place forever. The words hung between us like smoke, and I understood with perfect clarity that he wasn't just talking about location, he was talking about becoming me. Becoming a woman who found joy in apple turnovers and sunflower dish towels, who treasured simple gold bands and quiet Tuesday afternoons. He was talking about my life as if it were a cautionary tale, a fate to be avoided at all costs. I turned back to my dough, Not because I wanted to keep working, but because I needed something to do with my hands while I processed what had just happened. My wedding ring, the one I'd never removed except for surgery, felt strange on my finger without Henry's beside it. Unbalanced. Incomplete. How much? I asked. What? How much did you get for it? Mom, that's not really… How much? $1,200. The guy at the pawn shop said gold prices are really good right now. $1,200. The same amount Henry had saved for 3 months to buy when we got engaged, working double shifts at the factory and bringing lunch in a brown bag every day. The ring he'd slipped onto my finger with hands that trembled not from nervousness, but from exhaustion, from love, from the weight of promises he intended to keep for a lifetime. Is that all you came for? I asked, still not turning around. Mom, don't be like this. I'll pay you back, with interest. This opportunity is going to change everything. I wanted to ask what opportunity was worth selling your father's wedding ring. I wanted to ask when he'd become the kind of person who took things without permission. I wanted to ask how he could stand in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life I'd built with love and care, and dismiss it as something to escape from. Instead, I said, "The turnovers will be ready in 10 minutes if you want to stay." Behind me, I heard him shift uncomfortably. I actually need to get going. I'm meeting with the investor this afternoon. Of course he was. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the dough beneath my hands. I love you, Mom, he said, and I could hear in his voice that he meant it, which somehow made everything worse. I love you too. I listened to his footsteps cross the kitchen, heard the back door close, heard his car start and pull away from the curb. Only then did I stop pretending to work and allow myself to really look at my left hand, at the pale band of skin where Henry's ring had rested for 2 years since his death. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in front of me and tried to understand how we'd arrived at this moment. When had Lucas started seeing me not as his mother but as an obstacle to overcome? When had my life become something he feared inheriting rather than something he might honor or understand? If you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here, people who understand that sometimes the quietest moments hold the deepest truths. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I'd love to know where these words are traveling. The house felt different that evening, not just quieter. It had been quiet since Henry died, but emptier somehow, as if Lucas had taken more than just a ring. He'd taken some essential part of what made this place home, some invisible thread that connected past to present, memory to hope. I found myself touching my wedding ring repeatedly, feeling for the familiar weight of Henry's band beside it that would never be there again. Each time my finger found only smooth skin where his ring should have been, I felt the loss anew, not just of Henry, but of the son I thought I'd raised to value the things that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Outside my window, the neighborhood settled into evening routines. Porch lights flickered on, families gathered around dinner tables, children played in yards while parents watched from doorways. Normal life continuing its gentle rhythm while inside my kitchen, I sat alone with the realization that sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us in ways we never imagined possible. But something else was growing alongside the hurt, something I couldn't quite name yet, something that felt like understanding beginning to take root in soil that had been prepared by years of small disappointments and quiet betrayals I'd chosen not to see. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new possibilities for how to move forward, but tonight, I simply sat with the truth of what had happened, letting it settle into my bones like winter settling into the earth, necessary, inevitable, and somehow preparing the ground for whatever would grow next spring. 3 weeks passed before Lucas called again, not to apologize, not to explain about his mysterious opportunity, but to ask if I could watch his friend's cat while they went out of town, as if nothing had happened, as if taking his father's ring was just another Tuesday errand he'd completed and forgotten. "It's just for the weekend, Mom. Jasper is really low maintenance. You probably won't even see him." I stood in my living room, phone pressed to my ear, looking at the empty spot on Henry's side of the couch where he used to read his evening paper. The indentation in the cushion had finally disappeared, but I still avoided sitting there. "I don't really know anything about cats," I said. "There's nothing to know. Food in the bowl, water in the other bowl. Easy, easy." Everything was easy in Lucas's world when it involved other people doing things for him. "Whose cat is it?" "My friend Derek. You remember Derek, right? From high school?" I didn't remember Derek, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Lucas had friends he was close enough with to pet sit for, people he made time for, plans he prioritized. Yet he couldn't find time to return my calls unless he needed something. I suppose I could, I heard myself say, though I wasn't sure why. Great. I'll drop him off Friday evening. Derek's really grateful. Not Lucas was grateful. Derek was grateful. As if Lucas was just the middleman in a transaction that had nothing to do with him personally. Will you stay for dinner when you bring him? I could make your favorite pot roast. Oh, I can't Friday. I'm meeting some people about another business thing. But I'll just drop Jasper off quick and explain everything you need to know. Another business thing. Another opportunity. Another reason why spending time with his mother ranked somewhere below networking with strangers who might be useful to his ever-shifting career ambitions. Friday evening came, and Lucas arrived exactly at 7:30 with a carrier containing the most pathetic-looking cat I'd ever seen. Jasper was enormous and orange, with one ear that looked like it had been in a fight and lost, and eyes that seemed to judge everything they saw as insufficient for his standards. Here's his food, Lucas said, setting a bag of expensive-looking kibble on my counter. He eats twice a day, but don't let him convince you he needs more. He's a manipulator. I watched my son unpack cat supplies with more attention and care than he'd shown for anything involving me in months. Fresh water bowl, specific brand of treats, a detailed written schedule of feeding times. Derek really loves this cat, Lucas continued, arranging items with scientific precision. He rescued him from a shelter when Jasper was just a kitten. Been together 5 years now. 5 years of devotion to a pet. I wondered if Lucas had ever thought about the 34 years of devotion I'd given to him, or if that seemed less impressive because it was expected rather than chosen. Where are you and Derek going? I asked, genuinely curious about this friend who rated such careful attention to his cat's needs. Up to his family's cabin. Derek's been really stressed with work lately, and his girlfriend just broke up with him. He needs to get away, you know? I did know. I knew about stress and heartbreak and needing support from people who cared about you. I also knew about friends who noticed when you were struggling and made time to help you through difficult periods. That's nice that you're there for him, I said. Lucas finally looked at me directly for the first time since arriving. Yeah, well, Derek's been a good friend. We look out for each other. The contrast was so stark it took my breath away. Derek's broken heart required a weekend getaway and careful attention to pet care arrangements. My broken heart over losing Henry's ring had been dismissed as emotional overreaction that missed the bigger picture. I should get going, Lucas said, already moving toward the door. Derek's picking me up in 10 minutes. Of course. He paused at the threshold, and for a moment I thought he might say something about the ring, about us, about the careful distance that had grown between us since that afternoon in my kitchen. Instead, he said, "Thanks for doing this, Mom. It means a lot. To Derek," I thought. It means a lot to Derek. After he left, I sat on my couch with Jasper eyeing me suspiciously from his carrier. The cat clearly shared his owner's opinion that he deserved better accommodations than whatever I could provide. When I finally let him out, he stalked through my house like a property assessor, sniffing corners and examining furniture with obvious disappointment. "Well, Jasper," I said, watching him claim Henry's favorite chair with imperial authority, "I suppose we're stuck with each other." He fixed me with a stare that suggested this arrangement was entirely my fault, and he would be lodging a complaint with management at the earliest opportunity. The weekend stretched ahead of me with nothing but feeding schedules and litter box maintenance to mark the passage of time. I found myself talking to Jasper more than I'd talked to any living creature in weeks, explaining my daily routines while he listened with the polite attention of someone trapped in conversation with a boring relative. Saturday morning brought a text from Lucas. "Having great time. Thanks again for watching, Jay," followed by a photo of him and Derek grinning beside a lake, both holding fishing rods and looking like they didn't have a care in the world. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to remember the last time Lucas had looked that relaxed and happy in my presence. His smile in the picture was genuine, unguarded, the kind of expression I used to see when he was young and came home excited about something that had happened at school. When had I stopped being someone who made him smile like that? When had I become someone to be managed and avoided rather than enjoyed? Jasper appeared beside me, making a sound that was half meow, half complaint. It was breakfast time according to Derek's detailed schedule, and apparently my emotional crisis was interfering with proper service. "You're right," I told him, getting up to fill his food bowl. "At least one of us should eat on schedule." Sunday evening, Lucas returned to collect Jasper with the same efficiency he'd shown when dropping him off. Quick hello, gather supplies, minimal conversation. How was your weekend? I asked, though I'd already seen evidence of his good time posted on social media. Really good. Derek's doing better. Fresh air and fishing always help, you know? I nodded as if I did know, as if I had friends who took me fishing when my heart was broken, as if anyone had ever considered what might help me feel better during difficult times. How was Jasper? Lucas asked, scratching the cat behind his intact ear. We got along fine. He's got very definite opinions about everything. Lucas laughed, the first genuine sound of pleasure I'd heard from him in my presence for weeks. That's Jasper. Derek says he's got more personality than most people. More personality than his mother, apparently. More worth caring for, certainly. Well, Lucas said, closing the cat carrier with Jasper safely inside. Thanks again. Derek owes you one. Derek owes me one. Not Lucas. Derek. I watched from my front window as Lucas loaded Jasper into his car and drove away without looking back at the house where I stood waiting for some sign that this visit had meant something beyond pet care logistics. That night, the house felt different again. Not just empty, but deliberately emptied. As if my son was systematically removing himself from my life one polite, distant interaction at a time, leaving behind only the obligations he couldn't avoid and the favors he occasionally needed. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking at my left hand where Henry's ring should have been, and realized that losing the ring hadn't been the worst part of what happened 3 weeks ago. The worst part was discovering that my son saw me as someone whose feelings were obstacles to be overcome rather than treasures to be protected. The worst part was understanding that somewhere along the way, I had become invisible to the person who mattered most to me, and he didn't even notice enough to mind. But they didn't know what I had kept all along, hidden in places deeper than jewelry boxes, stronger than gold bands, more valuable than any opportunity money could buy. They didn't know about the quiet strength that grows in women who've spent decades nurturing others, who've learned to find joy in small things, who've discovered that dignity isn't something that can be taken from you unless you hand it over willingly. And I was beginning to realize that I had no intention of handing it over. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Elegant cream cardstock with gold lettering that announced Lucas's girlfriend Marina was throwing him a surprise birthday party. 35 years old, and apparently I was supposed to be surprised that nobody had thought to include me in the planning. I held the invitation in my kitchen, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Join us in celebrating Lucas Morrison's 35th birthday, it proclaimed in cheerful script. Below that, Marina's careful handwriting had added, your presence would make his day complete. My presence. As if I were a distant relative whose attendance was optional but polite to request. I'd met Marina exactly twice. Once when Lucas brought her to Sunday dinner 6 months ago, where she'd picked at my pot roast and mentioned 3 times that she was trying to eat clean. The second time at a coffee shop where she'd spent our entire 20-minute conversation checking her phone and making comments about how cozy my neighborhood was, using the tone people reserve for things they find quaint but wouldn't want for themselves. But I could be gracious. I could show up with a smile and a gift and pretend that being treated like a peripheral guest at my own son's birthday party was perfectly normal behavior from loving family members. I spent Tuesday afternoon shopping for something special, something that would remind Lucas of happier times when he actually enjoyed my company. In a small shop downtown, I found a vintage leather journal with his initials already embossed on the cover, LM, as if it had been waiting there just for him. The kind of journal where someone might write down their dreams, their plans, their thoughts about building a meaningful life. The saleswoman smiled when I explained it was for my son's birthday. How wonderful that you found something so perfect, she said. He'll treasure having something so personal from his mother. I hoped she was right. Friday evening, I drove to Marina's apartment in the part of town where young professionals lived in converted warehouses with exposed brick and industrial lighting. The kind of place that cost more in monthly rent than I spent on groceries in 3 months, but looked deliberately unfinished, as if comfort was less important than appearing sophisticated. I could hear the party before I reached the door. Laughter, music, the sound of people who belonged together celebrating something that mattered to them. I stood in the hallway for a moment, adjusting my dress and checking my lipstick, preparing to enter a room where I would be the oldest person by at least 20 years. Marina answered the door wearing something that probably cost more than my car payment. her smile bright and practiced. Elena, you made it. Lucas will be so surprised to see you. Surprised? Not happy. Surprised. She led me through rooms filled with people I'd never seen before. Young men and women holding wine glasses and discussing careers I couldn't follow, traveling to places I'd only seen in magazines, making plans for futures that required the kind of confidence I'd never possessed even when I was their age. "Lucas!" Marina called across the room. "Look who came." My son turned from a conversation with 3 other men, all wearing the same expensive casual clothes that suggested success without trying too hard. His face when he saw me was exactly what Marina had predicted. Surprised, but not the good kind of surprised. "Mom," he said, crossing the room with the careful smile he'd been using with me lately. "I didn't know you were coming. Marina sent me an invitation," I said, producing the cream cardstock as evidence. That's great. I'm glad you could make it." But his eyes were already scanning the room, looking for an escape route from this unexpected complication to his evening. I recognized the look from childhood, the expression he wore when I embarrassed him in front of friends by being too enthusiastic, too affectionate, too obviously his mother in situations where he preferred to maintain distance. "I brought you something," I said, holding out the carefully wrapped journal. He took it with the politeness of someone accepting something they didn't want but couldn't refuse. "Thanks, Mom. That's really thoughtful." "It has your initials," I said, suddenly feeling foolish for thinking this detail would matter to him. "I see that. Very nice." He didn't open it, didn't examine the leather or admire the craftsmanship, just held it like a package he would deal with later when witnesses weren't watching. "Lucas, come meet Jake's new girlfriend," one of his friends called from across the room. "She's in marketing, too. Lucas gestured vaguely toward his friend. "Mingle, you know? But help yourself to food. Marina made sure there's plenty of everything." And he was gone, leaving me standing alone in a room full of strangers who were too polite to stare, but clearly wondered what the older woman in the conservative dress was doing at their hip young professional gathering. I found my way to the food table, where Marina had indeed provided plenty of everything. Artisanal cheeses I couldn't pronounce, wines that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, tiny appetizers arranged like artwork on expensive plates. "You must be Lucas's mother," a woman beside me said. She was probably my age, but dressed and styled in a way that suggested she worked very hard to appear younger. "I'm Patricia, Jake's mom. Isn't this lovely?" I nodded, grateful for any conversation. "Marina did a beautiful job." "Oh, Marina's wonderful. So sophisticated. She and Lucas make such a striking couple, don't you think?" I looked across the room where Marina was laughing at something Lucas had said, her hand resting possessively on his arm. They did make a striking couple. Young, successful, perfectly matched in their ambitions and their casual confidence that the world owed them exactly what they wanted. "They seem very happy," I managed. "Jake tells me Lucas is doing so well with his new business venture. Finally found his calling, apparently. It's wonderful when our children find their path, isn't it?" New business venture. The mysterious opportunity that had required selling his father's wedding ring. I wondered if Patricia knew how Lucas had financed his calling, or if that detail had been edited out of the story he told his friends. "Yes," I said. "It's wonderful." For the next hour, I stood in corners and smiled at strangers, making small talk with people who were politely interested in me for exactly as long as social convention required. I watched my son work the room like a politician, charming everyone, telling stories that made people laugh, being the center of attention in ways that reminded me of the little boy who used to perform magic tricks for neighbors. But he never looked my way, never checked to see if I was enjoying myself, never brought me into conversations, never treated me like someone whose presence actually made his day complete, as Marina's invitation had claimed. Around 9 o'clock, as I was calculating how much longer I needed to stay before leaving would seem rude rather than simply practical, the toasts began. "I just want to say something about our birthday boy," one of Lucas's friends announced, raising his wine glass while the room quieted down. "Lucas Morrison is one of the most determined people I know. When he decides he wants something, he makes it happen, no matter what it takes." "Here, here," several voices responded. "To Lucas," the friend continued, "who never lets anything or anyone hold him back from going after what he deserves." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Lucas beamed, accepting congratulations and backslaps from people who admired his determination. His refusal to be held back by anyone or anything. Anyone like his sentimental mother who might object to selling family heirlooms. Anything like outdated notions of loyalty or respect for the past. I set down my wine glass and quietly made my way toward the door, hoping to leave without creating a scene. But Marina intercepted me in the hallway. "Elena, you're not leaving already, are you? We haven't even cut the cake yet." "It's been lovely," I said, "but I should get home. It's been a long day." "Oh, but Lucas will be so disappointed. He's been so busy with everyone tonight, but I know he wanted to spend time with you." The lie was so effortless, so smoothly delivered, that I almost admired her skill. Marina had watched the same evening I had, seen the same careful avoidance, witnessed the same polite dismissal. Yet here she was, rewriting reality with the confidence of someone who believed her own fiction. "Please give him my best wishes," I said, "and thank you for including me." "Of course. Family is so important, isn't it? Lucas talks about you all the time." Another lie, delivered with the same bright smile. I wondered if Marina actually believed these things, or if she simply understood that maintaining pleasant fictions was easier than acknowledging uncomfortable truths. I drove home through streets that seemed quieter than usual, past houses where families were settling in for evening routines, where mothers and sons might be sharing real conversations instead of performing social obligations for audiences who didn't really care about the relationships they were witnessing. At home, I sat in my kitchen with the leftover apple turnovers I'd made earlier in the week, thinking about toasts to people who never let anything hold them back. I thought about determination and getting what you deserve, about striking couples and sophisticated parties, and the kind of success that required stepping over whatever stood in your way. The journal I'd bought for Lucas sat on my counter where I'd left it, still in its gift bag. He'd forgotten to take it with him when he escaped my presence to rejoin his real celebration. Or maybe he hadn't forgotten. Maybe leaving it behind had been intentional, another small signal that my thoughts and gestures were unwelcome intrusions into the life he was building without me. I unwrapped the journal slowly, running my fingers over the leather cover, tracing his initials with my fingertip. Such a beautiful thing, made to hold important thoughts and dreams and plans, made to be treasured by someone who understood its value. But some people, I was learning, didn't know how to treasure things that came from love instead of ambition. Some people preferred gifts that advanced their image rather than honored their history. That night, I wrote in the journal myself, filling the first page with thoughts I'd been afraid to acknowledge even in my own mind. Words about disappointment and dignity, about love that wasn't returned and respect that wasn't earned. Words about learning the difference between being someone's mother and being someone's person, and discovering, perhaps too late, that I had somehow become only one of those things while believing I was both. But they didn't know what I had learned in 37 years of marriage, to a man who understood the difference between success and worth, between getting what you want and deserving what you get. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. I stopped calling Lucas first, stopped texting to check how his business was going, stopped making extra portions of his favorite meals just in case he might drop by. Instead, I waited, and learned what silence sounds like when it's not filled with hope. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, fully charged and perfectly silent. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. The clock on the wall ticked away seconds that stretched into minutes that accumulated into hours of nothing happening, no one calling, no one needing me for anything at all. I'd never realized how much of my daily energy had been spent anticipating Lucas's needs, thinking about what he might want for dinner if he visited, planning conversations we might have, imagining ways to be helpful, to be needed, to remain relevant in the life of this man I'd raised from a helpless baby into someone who no longer required anything I could offer. Now that I'd stopped reaching out, stopped trying to bridge the growing distance between us, the emptiness felt absolute, not just lonely. I'd been lonely since Henry died. This was different. This was irrelevant, unnecessary, easily forgotten. Tuesday mornings had always been my day to call him. Just a quick check-in, nothing demanding. "How are you doing, sweetheart? Anything new at work? Are you eating enough vegetables?" The kind of gentle maternal monitoring that had seemed natural when he was building his life, establishing his career, figuring out who he wanted to become. The first Tuesday I didn't call. I sat with my coffee and stared at the phone for 20 minutes, my finger hovering over his number. But that toast at his birthday party kept echoing in my mind, never letting anyone hold him back. the applause, his beaming face as people celebrated his determination to pursue what he wanted without interference from anyone or anything. I set the phone aside and finished my coffee in silence. The second Tuesday, I didn't even pick up the phone. I made my coffee, read yesterday's newspaper again, and pretended not to notice that my weekly routine had a gaping hole where my son's voice used to be. By the third Tuesday, I'd almost forgotten what day it was until I caught myself automatically reaching for the phone at exactly 9:30, the time I'd been calling him for 3 years, ever since Henry died and Lucas had said, "Mom, you should call me more often. I worry about you being alone all the time." That version of Lucas seemed like a character from someone else's story now. Someone who worried about his mother's loneliness, who wanted to hear from her, who treated her calls as connections rather than interruptions. The silence stretched into October, then November. The leaves outside my kitchen window changed from green to gold to brown, falling one by one until the branches stood bare against gray skies that matched my mood perfectly. I raked them myself, something Henry had always done, something Lucas had helped with when he was young and still thought spending time with his parents was acceptable entertainment. The physical work felt good, honest. Each leaf that went into the bag was a small accomplishment, evidence that I could still take care of things, still maintain my little corner of the world, even if no one noticed or cared whether I did. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought me cookies she'd made for her church bake sale, the ones that hadn't sold because they were too plain for the sophisticated tastes of her congregation. We sat at my kitchen table eating perfectly delicious oatmeal cookies and talking about her grandchildren, who called her twice a week from college and sent her pictures of their meals and their friends and their mundane daily adventures. "Sarah sent me 12 photos yesterday," Mrs. Patterson said, scrolling through her phone with the careful attention of someone still learning to navigate modern technology. "Just of her lunch. Can you imagine? But I love seeing what she's eating. It makes me feel like I'm there with her." 12 photos of lunch. Lucas hadn't sent me a photo of anything in 6 months. "That's lovely," I said, because it was. Because having grandchildren who thought you were worth 12 photos of cafeteria food was something to treasure, something to be grateful for, something that reminded you that love could be generous instead of calculated. After Mrs. Patterson left, I sat alone with my thoughts and tried to remember the last time Lucas had shared anything personal with me. Not requests for favors or quick updates about business developments, but real information about his life. What he was reading, what made him laugh, what worried him late at night, what dreams he was nurturing that had nothing to do with financial success. I couldn't remember. Somewhere along the way, our conversations had become purely transactional. He needed things. I provided them. He shared information when it served a purpose. I listened and responded appropriately. We'd maintained the structure of a relationship without any of its substance, like actors reading lines from a script neither of us particularly enjoyed. The journal sat on my kitchen table, where I'd been writing in it every evening after dinner, filling page after page with thoughts I'd never spoken aloud, observations about love and disappointment, and the particular sadness of watching someone you'd die for treat you like an inconvenience they couldn't quite figure out how to eliminate politely. I wrote about Henry, about how he'd made me feel precious even when I was tired and ordinary and wearing my oldest clothes. How he'd asked about my day as if the details actually mattered to him. How he'd listened to my stories about difficult customers at the store where I used to work with the attention most people reserved for much more important subjects. I wrote about Lucas as a child, about the way he used to run to me when he was hurt or scared, how his whole face would light up when I walked into a room, how he'd beg me to read him one more story, sing him one more song, stay with him just 5 more minutes before turning off his bedroom light. When had that changed? When had I transformed from someone he ran toward into someone he politely avoided? The answer came to me slowly, written across pages and pages of memories I'd been afraid to examine too closely. It hadn't been sudden, it had been gradual, so subtle I'd convinced myself it was normal growing up, natural independence, the healthy process of a child becoming an adult who didn't need his mother's constant presence. But this wasn't independence. This was abandonment. This was a deliberate decision to edit me out of the life I'd helped him build, to treat my love as something burdensome rather than precious, to value only what I could provide while dismissing who I actually was. I'd been so busy trying to maintain our connection that I'd failed to notice he'd already severed it. I'd been having conversations with someone who was no longer really listening, offering love to someone who'd decided he didn't want it, at least not from me, at least not in the simple, uncomplicated way I'd always given it. Thanksgiving arrived with an invitation that felt like charity. Lucas called exactly 1 week beforehand, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone fulfilling an obligation they'd rather avoid. "Hey, Mom, Marina's hosting Thanksgiving this year, and we'd love to have you join us. We'd love to have you." The careful pluralization that made it clear this invitation had been discussed, negotiated, agreed upon by the couple as a unit, before being extended to the peripheral family member who required occasional inclusion to maintain appearances. "That's very kind," I said, though kindness had nothing to do with it. "Marina's really excited about cooking her first big holiday meal. She's been planning the menu for weeks." Of course she had, because Marina was the kind of person who planned menus and hosted elegant gatherings and turned holidays into performance art that showcased her sophistication and attention to detail. Unlike some people who might show up with simple dishes made from decades-old family recipes that weren't quite trendy enough for modern tastes. "I'd be happy to bring something," I offered. "Oh, that's okay. Marina has everything covered. She's really into doing it all herself this year. Everything covered. My contribution not required, my participation optional, my presence merely tolerated as long as I didn't interfere with Marina's vision of what a proper Thanksgiving should look like." I declined politely, claiming I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely a lie. I was sick, just not in any way that medicine could cure. "Are you sure?" Lucas asked, but I could hear the relief in his voice. "I mean, if you're really not feeling up to it, I think I'll just have a quiet day at home," I said. "But thank you for thinking of me." Thinking of me. Another careful phrase that meant nothing while sounding considerate. After I hung up, I sat in my empty house and realized I wasn't even disappointed anymore. I was simply done. Done pretending that obligation was the same as love. Done accepting scraps of attention and calling them meals. Done participating in the fiction that we had a real relationship when what we actually had was a series of polite interactions designed to ease his guilt and maintain my hope. That Thanksgiving, I made myself a small turkey breast and all the fixings Henry and I used to enjoy together. I set the table with my good china, lit candles, played soft music, and treated myself to the kind of dinner I would have prepared for honored guests. Because that's what I'd decided to become in my own life, an honored guest rather than someone waiting in the corners for permission to matter. And as I sat there eating my perfectly cooked meal in my beautifully set dining room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The quiet satisfaction of taking care of myself instead of waiting for someone else to value me enough to include me in their plans. But they didn't know what I had discovered in those pages of writing, those weeks of silence, those hours of learning to be alone without being lonely. They didn't know about the strength that grows in women who stop apologizing for taking up space, who stop shrinking themselves to fit into other people's ideas of what they should be. They didn't know that I was learning the difference between being needed and being wanted, and deciding that being wanted was optional, while being respected was not. December arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after storms pass, when the air feels different and you can see things that were hidden before. I woke up one morning and realized I hadn't checked my phone for Lucas's name in 3 days. Not because I was trying to be strong or prove a point, but because I'd genuinely forgotten to look. That should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like freedom. I made my coffee that morning and sat in Henry's chair, something I'd avoided for 2 years, as if occupying his space was presumptuous or disrespectful to his memory. But when I settled into the worn leather that still held the faint impression of his body, I felt him with me in a way I hadn't since he died. Not sad presence, but comfort, understanding. He never made me feel small, I said aloud to the empty room, my voice surprising me with its steadiness. That was the difference I'd been struggling to name. Henry had seen my daily routines, my simple pleasures, my uncomplicated approach to life, and found them worthy of respect. He'd never looked at me like I was someone he'd outgrown, or someone whose values embarrassed him in front of people whose opinions mattered more than mine. I opened the journal and wrote, "It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity." The words appeared on the page as if they'd been waiting there all along, and I knew they were true. The sharp ache of rejection had dulled into something else, understanding, not just about Lucas, but about myself, about who I'd been before I started measuring my worth by his attention, before I'd begun shrinking myself to fit into spaces where I wasn't really welcome. I'd been someone once, someone with opinions and preferences, and ways of seeing the world that didn't require anyone else's approval to be valid. Somewhere in the years of widowhood and rejected phone calls and polite dismissals, I'd forgotten that person existed. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to the art supply store downtown and bought watercolor paints, brushes, and paper. Not because I had any particular artistic talent, but because I remembered loving to paint when Lucas was small. Those Sunday afternoons when he'd nap and I'd sit at the kitchen table trying to capture the way light fell through our window onto the geraniums on the sill. I'd stopped painting when Lucas got older and needed more elaborate entertainment. When weekends became filled with soccer games and birthday parties and the complex social calendar of active children. Then Henry got sick, and there was no time for anything except doctors and medications and the exhausting work of watching someone you love fight a battle you can't help them win. After Henry died, I'd told myself I was too sad for creative pursuits, too empty to make anything beautiful. But sitting in the art store, surrounded by possibilities and colors and the quiet excitement of people starting new projects, I realized I'd been lying to myself. I wasn't too sad to paint. I was afraid to enjoy something that wasn't about taking care of other people. Back home, I cleared a space at the kitchen table and arranged my new supplies with the careful attention of someone preparing for something important. I had no plan, no vision of what I wanted to create. I simply wanted to remember what it felt like to make choices based on pleasure rather than obligation. The first stroke of blue across white paper felt like coming back to life. I painted for 3 hours that day, losing myself in the simple act of watching colors blend and separate, discovering what happened when yellow met purple at their edges, learning again that creating something didn't require it to be good or meaningful or useful to anyone else. When I finally stopped, I had a small painting of nothing in particular, just shapes and colors that pleased me, just evidence that my hands could still make things that hadn't existed before. I propped it against the sugar bowl and felt proud in a way I hadn't experienced since I couldn't remember when. That evening, while the paint dried, I called Mrs. Patterson and asked if she'd like to come for dinner the next night. Not because I was lonely, though I was, but because I realized I actually enjoyed her company. She was funny and smart and unafraid to have opinions about things, qualities I'd forgotten to value in myself and others during the years I'd spent trying to be whatever version of myself might be more acceptable to my son. "I'd love to," she said immediately. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," I told her, and meant it. We had pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans from my garden, the kind of simple meal I'd started apologizing for when Lucas began dating Marina. But Mrs. Patterson ate everything with obvious enjoyment, complimented the seasoning, and asked for the recipe for my rolls. "My grandmother would have loved these," she said, breaking open a second roll and watching the steam rise. "She always said you could tell a woman's character by her bread." What did she mean by that? Patience, I think. Attention to detail, care for the people you're feeding, the willingness to do something that takes time and doesn't provide instant gratification. I thought about that while we ate. When had I stopped seeing those qualities as virtues and started seeing them as evidence of my limitations? When had simple become insufficient in my own mind? After dinner, Mrs. Patterson admired my watercolor experiment with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that new beginnings were worth celebrating regardless of skill level. "I used to paint too," she said. "Stopped when Roger got sick. Never picked it up again after he died." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think I forgot I was allowed to want things for myself. Got so used to wanting things for other people that I lost track of what made me happy independent of them." I knew exactly what she meant. "Maybe you could start again," I suggested. "We could paint together sometimes." Her face lit up in a way that reminded me how much joy there was to be found in simple plans, uncomplicated friendships, the kind of connections that didn't require you to be anyone other than who you already were. That night, I wrote in the journal again. I am remembering who I was before I became afraid of being too much or not enough. The words felt revolutionary. Over the next few weeks, I established new routines that had nothing to do with waiting for Lucas to need me. I painted most mornings, started reading novels again, took walks through neighborhoods I'd never explored just because they were beautiful, and I had time to notice beauty. I cleaned out closets and rediscovered clothes I'd stopped wearing because they were too young or too bright for someone my age. According to whom? When had I decided that aging meant choosing beige over red, comfort over style, invisibility over presence? I tried on a blue dress I hadn't worn in 3 years and realized it still fit, still flattered me, still made me feel like someone worth looking at. I wore it to the grocery store for no reason except that I liked how I felt in it, and received 2 compliments from complete strangers, evidence that my instincts about my own attractiveness were more reliable than my son's apparent assessment of my irrelevance. Christmas was coming, and for the first time since Henry died, I felt excited about it instead of dreading it. Not because I expected anything from Lucas, I'd learned better than that, but because I was rediscovering the pleasure of celebration for its own sake. I bought a small tree and decorated it with ornaments Henry and I had collected over 37 years of marriage, each one carrying memories that belonged to me whether anyone else treasured them or not. The angel on top was one Lucas had made in 2nd grade, all crooked construction paper and glitter, more precious to me than any expensive decoration Marina might prefer for her sophisticated holiday displays. I strung lights around my windows, hung a wreath on my door, and baked cookies just because I wanted the house to smell like vanilla and cinnamon. Not for anyone else's enjoyment, but for my own. Because I was someone who deserved to live in a house that felt festive and warm and full of small pleasures. I was addressing Christmas cards when Lucas finally called. 3 weeks since our Thanksgiving conversation, long enough that I'd stopped expecting to hear from him, but not quite long enough that I'd stopped hoping. "Hey, Mom, how are you doing?" "I'm doing very well, actually," I said, and realized I meant it completely. Good. Listen, Marina and I wanted to invite you for Christmas Eve dinner. Her parents are coming down from Portland, and she thought it would be nice for you to meet them. Meet them, as if I were a new addition to the family rather than the woman who'd given birth to the guest of honor. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I've already made other plans." "Other plans?" He sounded genuinely surprised, as if the possibility of my independent social life had never occurred to him. "Mrs. Patterson and I are having dinner together. She's been alone since her husband died, and we thought it might be nice to celebrate together instead of separately." "Oh, well, maybe you could do both. Come by for drinks beforehand or dessert after. Maybe I could rearrange my plans, compromise my evening, fit myself into whatever small space his real family might have available for the peripheral mother whose presence was optional but socially appropriate." "I don't think so," I said gently. "But thank you for thinking of me. I hope you and Marina have a lovely time with her parents." There was silence on his end, the kind of quiet that suggested he was processing something unexpected. "Are you sure you're okay, Mom? You sound different. Not upset or hurt or disappointed, which were the emotions he'd probably prepared to manage. Different, which was harder to categorize or dismiss. "I'm perfectly fine, sweetheart. Actually, I'm better than I've been in quite a while." And that, I realized as I said it, was the complete truth. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. And clarity, I was discovering, felt remarkably like freedom. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in January, mixed in with credit card offers and utility bills like any other piece of mail. But the moment I saw the return address, Morrison and Associates Legal Services, my heart began beating faster, though I couldn't say why. I set it aside while I finished my coffee, the cream envelope sitting on the kitchen table like an uninvited guest whose presence changes the entire atmosphere of a room. Outside my window, snow was beginning to fall in fat, lazy flakes that suggested the kind of storm that would transform the world into something clean and different by evening. When I finally opened it, the letterhead was elegant, expensive-looking. The kind of stationery that suggested serious matters handled by serious people who charged serious money for their time. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," it began in formal typescript, "we represent the estate of Mrs. Dorothy Castellani, who passed away on December 15th. According to her will, you have been named as a beneficiary. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the details of your inheritance. Dorothy Castellani." The name floated in my memory like a half-remembered dream. Dorothy, Mrs. Castellani from Pine Street, the elderly woman who used to shop at the market where I'd worked for so many years, the one who always asked specifically for me to help her, who saved her shopping for Thursdays when she knew I'd be working the early shift. She'd been one of those customers who lingered to chat, who treated grocery shopping as a social activity rather than a chore to be completed quickly. While other customers tapped their feet impatiently behind her, she'd tell me stories about her late husband, ask about my family, comment on how lovely I looked that day, even when I felt tired and ordinary. I'd always made time for her, even during busy periods when the line stretched halfway down the cereal aisle. Something about her reminded me of my own grandmother, the way she moved carefully but with dignity, the way she dressed up for errands as if going out in public was an occasion worth honoring. "You're too kind to an old lady," she used to say when I'd help her load her groceries, though she was never actually old in any way that mattered. Just careful and deliberate and grateful for small courtesies that most people had stopped expecting from the world. I hadn't seen her in over a year, not since I'd left the market. Had she continued shopping there, wondering what happened to the cashier who always remembered that she preferred her bread unsliced and her bananas just slightly green? Had she asked about me when I stopped appearing at Register 3 every Thursday morning? The thought that she'd remembered me, that I'd somehow mattered enough to be included in her will, left me staring at the letter with tears I hadn't expected. When was the last time someone had thought of me as worth remembering, worth including, worth leaving something to? I called the number on the letterhead and spoke with a receptionist who scheduled an appointment for the following Monday. "Bring identification," she said efficiently. "Mr. Morrison likes to handle these matters promptly. Mr. Morrison, no relation, despite sharing my married name. The universe's little joke about the strange coincidences that sometimes shaped ordinary lives." That weekend passed slowly. I found myself thinking about Dorothy Castellani more than I had in months, remembering conversations we'd shared while I rang up her weekly groceries. She'd been a widow for 15 years when I first met her, living alone in a house that had been designed for a family, but somehow never felt empty when she described it. "I still cook like there are two of us," she'd told me once, purchasing ingredients for meals that would clearly feed more than one person. "Sometimes I think Harold's still there, wondering what's taking so long with dinner." She'd talked about Harold the way I talked about Henry, not as someone who was gone, but as someone who remained present in ways that couldn't be measured or explained to people who'd never lost someone essential to their daily happiness. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of January day that made you grateful for warm coats and heated cars. The law office occupied the entire third floor of a downtown building I'd passed countless times but never entered, the kind of place where important people handled important matters with the gravity they deserved. Mr. Morrison turned out to be a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who'd spent years delivering news both good and bad to people who weren't always prepared for either. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair upholstered in leather that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "I'm sorry for your loss. Mrs. Castellani spoke of you often." "She did?" "Oh, yes, quite fondly. She said you were one of the few people who still understood that shopping could be a pleasure rather than an ordeal, that conversation was more valuable than efficiency." I felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. She was always so kind to me. The feeling was clearly mutual. He opened a file folder with Dorothy's name printed neatly on the tab. "Mrs. Castellani was quite specific about her intentions regarding you. She left instructions that I was to explain not just what she's leaving you, but why." He adjusted his reading glasses and consulted a document that looked official and important. In her words, "Elena Morrison showed me kindness when kindness wasn't required, patience when patience wasn't convenient, and dignity when dignity wasn't profitable. She treated an old woman like someone worth knowing, worth talking to, worth remembering. I want her to have something that reminds her of her own worth, something that proves not everyone forgets the people who make ordinary days more beautiful." The tears came then, unstoppable and somehow cleansing. Dorothy had seen me, really seen me, not just as someone performing a service, but as someone worth valuing for qualities that had nothing to do with usefulness or convenience or youth. "She's left you her house," Mr. Morrison continued gently, allowing me time to absorb what he'd already told me. "The property on Pine Street, along with its contents and a modest trust fund for maintenance and taxes. She was very clear that she wanted it to go to someone who would understand its value beyond its monetary worth. Her house, the place she'd described with such love, where she still cooked for 2 people and felt Harold's presence in the familiar rooms they'd shared for 43 years. "I don't understand," I managed. "We barely knew each other." Mrs. Castellani would have disagreed with that assessment. He smiled. "She kept a notebook, recorded conversations she'd had with people who mattered to her. Your name appears quite frequently, along with observations about your character that suggest she knew you better than you might think. A notebook, like the journal I'd been writing in, except Dorothy had been recording connections instead of solitude, relationships instead of rejection, evidence of human kindness instead of catalogs of disappointment. She mentions that you always asked about her health, remembered details about her life from week to week, made her feel like someone whose stories were worth hearing. She says you have the gift of making people feel seen, which she considered more valuable than all the material possessions people usually chase. The gift of making people feel seen. I thought about Lucas, about how invisible I'd become in his life, how my stories and concerns and daily experiences had been reduced to interruptions he tolerated rather than connections he treasured. But Dorothy had seen something else. Dorothy had recognized qualities in me that I'd started to doubt existed, that I'd begun to think were weaknesses rather than strengths in a world that valued efficiency over empathy. "There are a few conditions," Mr. Morrison continued. "Nothing onerous. She simply asks that you maintain the garden she and Harold planted together, that you keep the house lived in rather than selling it immediately, and that you remember kindness isn't old-fashioned just because it's not profitable." Conditions that weren't restrictions but invitations. Invitations to continue the kind of life Dorothy had valued, to honor the qualities she'd recognized in me, to believe that gentleness and attention to small beauties were virtues worth preserving. I walked through the house that afternoon with keys that felt foreign in my hand, touring rooms that belonged to me now but still felt like Dorothy's. Everything was clean and carefully maintained, decorated with the accumulated treasures of a long marriage and a life lived with attention to beauty rather than fashion. Photographs covered every surface. Dorothy and Harold at their wedding, on vacations, with friends and family, growing older together through decades of shared experiences. Books filled built-in shelves, their spines worn smooth by repeated reading. The kitchen windows overlooked the garden Dorothy had mentioned, dormant now but showing signs of careful planning in the placement of trees and the geometric arrangement of what would become flower beds come spring. In the bedroom, I found the notebook Mr. Morrison had mentioned, a simple composition book like children used in school, filled with Dorothy's careful handwriting. I opened it to a random page and found my own name. Elena noticed I was moving slowly today and asked if my arthritis was bothering me. When I said yes, she told me about her mother's remedy, warm baths with Epsom salts, not because she was trying to sell me anything, but because she genuinely wanted me to feel better. How long has it been since someone offered me kindness without wanting something in return? I turned more pages, finding entry after entry that recorded small interactions I'd forgotten, but she'd treasured. Conversations about weather and recipes and grandchildren, moments I'd considered routine parts of my job, but she'd experienced as gifts of human connection. Elena always has time for one more question, one more story, even when the line behind me is getting impatient. Today, she said my new coat looked lovely on me, and I felt beautiful for the first time in months. She has a gift for seeing good things and saying them aloud. Reading her words, I understood something I'd missed while it was happening. Those Thursday morning conversations hadn't just been polite customer service. They'd been friendship, real friendship, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, disguised as grocery store interactions because that's where we'd happened to meet. Dorothy had known me better than my own son did. She'd seen qualities in me that Lucas had learned to dismiss, had valued traits he'd been taught to consider weaknesses. She'd recognized my worth when I'd almost forgotten it existed. That evening, I called Mrs. Patterson to share the news, needing someone who would understand what this inheritance meant beyond its practical value. "Oh, honey," she said when I finished explaining, "that woman saw what the rest of us see in you. What you're just starting to remember about yourself." "What do you mean?" "You make people feel important. You pay attention to things that matter. You're gentle in a world that's forgotten the value of gentleness." Dorothy Castellani was smart enough to recognize that, and generous enough to reward it. After I hung up, I sat in my current kitchen and thought about Dorothy's kitchen, about the choice I now faced between the life I'd known and the possibility of something entirely different. Not just a new house, but a new way of thinking about my own value, my own worth, my own right to occupy space in the world. Change was coming. I could feel it in the weight of those keys in my purse, in the memory of Dorothy's words about my character, in the quiet understanding that someone had thought I deserved better than I'd been settling for. The storm that had been building in my life was about to break, and for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what it might wash away. Moving day arrived with the kind of crisp February morning that makes everything seem possible. Mrs. Patterson had volunteered her grandson to help with the heavy lifting, and by afternoon, my modest belongings looked almost lost in Dorothy's spacious rooms, but not lonely, expectant, as if they were waiting to see what kind of life we might build together in this house that had been blessed with love. I was unpacking books in the living room when the doorbell rang. Through the lace curtains, I could see Lucas standing on the front porch, his hands stuffed deep in his coat pockets and his expression unreadable. He'd never visited my old house without calling first, but apparently my new address had warranted an exception to that courtesy. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, his eyes already scanning past me to catalog the interior of my unexpected new home. "I got your message about moving. This is quite a place." I'd left him a voicemail 3 days earlier with my new address, simple and factual. No explanation, no invitation for discussion, just information he needed in case of emergencies. The kind of communication he'd taught me to expect, efficient and practical, stripped of anything that might be mistaken for emotional manipulation. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him enter Dorothy's world. My world now, though the transition still felt surreal enough that I sometimes caught myself thinking I was visiting rather than living here. He moved through the living room like an appraiser, taking inventory of the antique furniture, the crystal lamps, the oil paintings of landscapes that had never existed anywhere, except in some long-dead artist's imagination of how beauty should look when captured in permanent form. "How exactly did you end up here?" he asked, running his finger along the mahogany surface of a side table that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "I inherited it," I said simply. "From who?" "A friend." "What friend?" "Mom, you don't have friends with houses like this." The casual dismissal hung in the air between us like smoke from an extinguished flame. Of course I didn't have friends with valuable possessions. Of course my social circle couldn't include people with resources worth inheriting. Of course my life was too small and ordinary to intersect with anything Lucas might consider impressive. "Her name was Dorothy Castellani," I said, my voice steady despite the anger beginning to simmer beneath my carefully maintained composure. "I knew her from the grocery store." "You knew her from—" He stopped, clearly recalibrating his understanding of the situation. "Someone left you a house because you were nice to them at work?" The way he said it made my kindness sound like a calculated investment, a long-term strategy designed to manipulate elderly customers into financial gratitude, as if the idea that someone might value me for my character rather than my usefulness was so unlikely it required suspicious examination. "Dorothy appreciated qualities that apparently not everyone values anymore," I said. He was examining a family photo on the mantel, Dorothy and Harold at their golden anniversary party, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd clearly adored them both. "This is incredible, Mom. Do you have any idea what a place like this is worth?" "I'm not interested in what it's worth, Lucas. I'm interested in what it means." He set the photo down and turned to face me fully for the first time since arriving. "What it means? Mom, this is a fortune sitting here. Prime real estate in the best part of town. You could sell this place and live comfortably for the rest of your life." Live comfortably. As if comfort was the highest aspiration available to someone my age, as if I should be grateful for the opportunity to convert Dorothy's gift into financial security, rather than honoring the love that had created it. "I'm not selling it," I said. "But why would you want to live here? It's way too big for one person. The maintenance alone must be astronomical. And you don't need all this space. All these things you'll never use. All these things I'd never use. Like the piano in the corner where Dorothy used to play hymns on Sunday mornings. Like the dining room table where she and Harold had hosted dinner parties for friends who appreciated conversation more than efficiency. Like the garden where they'd planted roses for their 25th anniversary, now dormant but not dead, waiting for spring to reveal what careful tending could accomplish. "Maybe I don't need them," I said. "But maybe I deserve them." The words surprised us both. I'd never spoken about deserving anything before, never claimed space or beauty or comfort as rights rather than privileges to be earned through service to others. Lucas stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to join the circus. Deserve them? Mom, you worked at a grocery store. This house belongs to people who built empires, who contributed something significant to the world. And there it was, the truth that had been lurking beneath every polite conversation, every distant phone call, every carefully managed interaction we'd shared for years. In Lucas's mind, I was someone whose contributions weren't significant enough to warrant beauty or comfort or the simple pleasure of living in a house that made me happy. I was someone whose dreams were too small, whose accomplishments too modest, whose value too limited to justify occupying space that might be better used by people who'd achieved more impressive things with their lives. Like selling your father's wedding ring to finance business ventures that never materialize? I asked quietly. His face flushed red. That's different. That was an investment in the future, not hoarding things you can't afford to maintain just because some old lady felt sorry for you. Felt sorry for me. As if Dorothy's gift had been charity rather than recognition, pity rather than love, obligation rather than choice. As if the notebook full of observations about my character had been lies she'd told herself to justify helping someone who clearly needed assistance. Dorothy didn't feel sorry for me, Lucas. She saw me. She valued me. She understood that kindness and patience and treating people with dignity aren't weaknesses or failures or signs that someone hasn't accomplished enough to matter. Mom, you're being ridiculous. I never said you don't matter. You've never said I do matter either. When was the last time you called me because you wanted to talk to me, not because you needed something? When was the last time you asked about my life, my thoughts, my feelings about anything? When was the last time you treated me like someone whose opinions might be worth hearing? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, and I watched him realize he couldn't answer any of those questions in a way that didn't make him sound exactly like the person I was describing. I've been busy, he said finally. Yes, you have. Too busy for Sunday dinners. Too busy for birthday celebrations that include your mother. Too busy for conversations that last longer than 10 minutes. Too busy for anything that might interfere with your pursuit of the success that's apparently so much more important than the woman who raised you. That's not fair. Fair? I laughed, and the sound surprised me with its strength. You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you what's not fair, Lucas. What's not fair is spending 34 years loving someone more than your own life, only to discover they see you as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. I don't see you as an embarrassment. Then why don't you introduce me to your friends as your mother instead of just Elena? Why do you schedule our visits around times when Marina isn't available to witness them? Why do you look relieved every time I decline an invitation to spend time with your real life? Each question landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread wider than the initial impact. I could see him processing the accuracy of my observations, recognizing behaviors he'd thought were subtle enough to go unnoticed. You're being dramatic, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm being honest. For the first time in years, I'm being completely honest about what this relationship has become. You've turned me into someone who apologizes for existing, who feels grateful for scraps of attention, who measures her worth by how little space she takes up in your increasingly important life. Mom, I'm not finished. The words came from some deep place I'd almost forgotten existed, some reservoir of strength that had been waiting for permission to surface. You took your father's ring without asking because you decided my feelings about it were less important than your financial opportunities. You treat my concerns as inconveniences to be dismissed rather than communications from someone who loves you. You've made me feel ashamed of the life I built, the values I hold, the simple pleasures that bring me joy. I walked to the window that overlooked Dorothy's garden, my garden now, where spring bulbs were already pushing through the frozen ground with the stubborn optimism of things that knew their time was coming. But Dorothy saw something different. Dorothy saw someone whose kindness mattered, whose attention was valuable, whose company was a gift rather than an obligation. She saw someone worthy of respect, worthy of beauty, worthy of living in a house this lovely, because she understood that worth isn't measured only by bank accounts and business achievements. When I turned back to face him, Lucas was staring at his hands, his usual confidence replaced by something that might have been shame if he'd been capable of that level of self-reflection. I love you, I continued, my voice gentler now but no less certain. I will always love you. but I'm done letting that love make me smaller than I am. I'm done apologizing for taking up space, for having feelings, for expecting basic respect from my only child. So what does that mean? He asked quietly. It means I'm keeping this house. I'm keeping the garden. I'm keeping the piano and the dining room table and all the beautiful things Dorothy thought I deserved to live among. It means I'm done waiting for you to decide I'm worthy of your time and attention. And if I want to be part of your life, what then? I looked at him standing in Dorothy's living room, my living room now, surrounded by evidence of a life lived with intention and care and mutual respect. He looked younger than his 35 years, uncertain in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child, facing consequences for choices he hadn't fully considered. Then you learn to treat me like someone you're glad to know, I said. Like someone whose stories matter, whose feelings count, whose presence in your life is a privilege rather than a burden. You learn to love me the way Dorothy did, for who I am, not despite who I am. The silence that followed felt different than the uncomfortable quiet that had characterized so many of our recent interactions. This felt like possibility, like a door opening onto something that might be better than what we'd been settling for. I don't know how to do that, he said finally. And for the first time in years, he sounded like my son, instead of a stranger who happened to share my last name. Then, you learn, I said simply, the same way I'm learning to value myself enough to require it. Spring came early that year, arriving with the kind of gentle warmth that makes you believe in second chances. By April, Dorothy's garden had revealed itself in ways that took my breath away. Tulips in shades of purple and yellow I'd never seen together, daffodils clustered like small suns along the stone pathway, and rose bushes that were already showing signs of the spectacular blooms they'd produce come summer. I spent my mornings there with coffee and the journal that had become my closest companion, writing about the small miracles of watching things grow when they're given proper care and attention. The garden had taught me something important about patience, how beautiful things take time to develop, how the most spectacular displays come from bulbs that spend months in darkness, gathering strength for their moment in the light. Lucas had called twice since our confrontation in February. Not the rushed, obligation-driven calls I'd grown accustomed to, but longer conversations where he asked questions and actually waited for my answers. The first time, he'd wanted to know about the garden, whether I was enjoying the house, if I needed help with anything. I'm managing beautifully, I'd told him, and meant it completely. The second call came in late March, when he'd phoned to tell me that his latest business venture had failed, that the money from Henry's ring had been lost to another person's greed and his own poor judgment. I know you're probably thinking I told you so, he'd said, his voice carrying a humility I hadn't heard in years. Actually, I wasn't thinking that at all, I'd replied honestly. I was thinking that I'm sorry you're disappointed, and that failure isn't permanent unless you decide it is. The silence that followed told me he'd expected anger, recriminations, the kind of response his behavior had certainly earned. Instead, he'd gotten grace from a woman who'd learned the difference between loving someone and enabling them, between supporting someone and sacrificing yourself for their comfort. Mrs. Patterson had become a regular visitor, joining me for afternoon tea and painting sessions that had evolved into something resembling actual skill. She'd brought her own brushes and paints, and together we'd begun creating a series of small canvases that captured the garden's transformation through the seasons. You're blooming too, you know, she'd said one afternoon, standing back to admire her painting of the cherry tree that dominated the backyard. There's something different about you since you moved here, stronger, more yourself, if that makes sense. It made perfect sense. I felt like myself in ways I'd forgotten were possible, confident in my opinions, comfortable with my choices, unashamed of finding joy in simple pleasures that didn't require anyone else's approval to be valid. I'd joined a book club at the library, started volunteering at the animal shelter on weekends, and signed up for piano lessons with a teacher who assured me that 72 was not too old to learn new songs. My days had shape and purpose that belonged entirely to me, filled with activities I chose because they brought me pleasure, rather than because they might make someone else more likely to value my company. The house had come alive under my care. I'd hung my own paintings in the hallway, rearranged furniture to better catch the morning light, planted herbs in Dorothy's kitchen garden that filled the air with scents that made cooking feel like celebration. Every room bore evidence that someone lived there who understood the difference between a house and a home. Flowers on tables, books left open to pages I planned to return to, Afghans draped over chairs where I sat to read in the evenings. In May, an invitation arrived that surprised me more than Dorothy's inheritance had. Elegant calligraphy on cream cardstock announced Lucas and Marina's engagement, and at the bottom, in Marina's careful handwriting, "Your presence would make our celebration complete." I stared at the invitation for a long time, remembering another party where my presence had been described in similar terms, while my actual experience suggested something quite different. But this felt different somehow, not because the words had changed, but because I had changed, because my sense of my own worth no longer depended on how other people chose to treat me. I called Lucas that evening to congratulate him, and was surprised by the genuine warmth in his voice when he answered. "Mom, I was hoping you'd call. Did you get our invitation?" "I did. Congratulations, sweetheart. When's the wedding?" "September. We're thinking about a small ceremony, maybe something in a garden. Marina's been looking at venues, but honestly, we haven't found anything that feels right yet." I looked out my kitchen window at the backyard where Dorothy's roses were beginning to show their first blooms, where the cherry tree was heavy with fruit that would ripen just in time for late summer celebrations, where 43 years of love and careful tending had created something that would make any ceremony feel blessed. "You could have it here," I heard myself say. The silence that followed was different than the uncomfortable quiet of our past conversations. This felt like surprise, gratitude, the kind of pause that happens when someone receives a gift they hadn't dared to hope for. "Really? You would do that?" "I would be honored to do that. Marina would love that. She's been talking about how beautiful your garden is, how perfect it would be for a small wedding, but we didn't want to impose. As if my son's wedding was an inconvenience rather than a celebration I'd been dreaming of since he was old enough to talk about the family he might someday create. It wouldn't be imposing, Lucas. It would be sharing something beautiful with people I love. We spent an hour talking about possibilities, where the ceremony might take place under the cherry tree, how we could arrange seating in the rose garden, whether the small gazebo in the back corner would work for photos. For the first time in years, we were planning something together, collaborating rather than negotiating, treating each other like allies rather than obstacles. "Mom," he said as our conversation was winding down, "I want you to know that I've been thinking about what you said in February, about how I've been treating you, about what kind of son I've been. Lucas, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do. I do have to say this." His voice carried the determined tone of someone who'd been preparing for a difficult conversation. "You were right about everything. About me being too busy, about treating you like an embarrassment, about taking you for granted while expecting you to be grateful for whatever attention I could spare." I sat down at Dorothy's kitchen table, the one where I now ate meals that tasted better because they weren't seasoned with loneliness, where I planned days that belonged to me rather than waiting for other people to decide I was worth including. "I don't know when I became that person," he continued. "When I started thinking that success meant leaving behind the things that actually made me successful, like having a mother who taught me about kindness and persistence, and treating people with dignity, regardless of what they could do for me. You were trying to build a life," I said gently. "That's what young people do. Sometimes they have to push against the past to make room for the future. But I didn't have to be cruel about it. I didn't have to treat you like something to be ashamed of rather than someone to be proud of. Dad's ring. That wasn't about money, was it? That was about respect. About asking instead of taking. About treating your feelings like they mattered as much as my opportunities. The ring. I'd almost forgotten about it in the month since I'd stopped defining my worth by Lucas's ability to see it. The ring was just a thing, Lucas. What hurt was being dismissed, having my feelings treated like obstacles to overcome, rather than communications from someone who loves you. I know that now. And I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what I was doing to you, what I was destroying with my selfishness. I felt tears coming, but they were different than the tears I'd cried in those dark months after Henry's death, after Lucas's emotional abandonment, after I'd begun to believe that love was something I gave rather than something I deserved to receive. These tears felt like relief, like healing, like the sound rain makes when it finally breaks a drought that's lasted too long. "I forgave you months ago," I said. "The question is whether you can forgive yourself and do better going forward." "I want to do better." Marina's been helping me understand some things about how I've been acting, about what kind of husband I want to be, what kind of son I should have been all along. Marina, the sophisticated young woman who'd seemed so dismissive of my simple lifestyle, was apparently wise enough to recognize that healthy relationships required mutual respect rather than careful management of inconvenient family members. "She sounds like a keeper," I said, and meant it. "She is. And she's excited about getting to know you better, about becoming part of a family that includes someone who taught me everything important I know about love, even if I forgot those lessons for a while." After we hung up, I sat in Dorothy's kitchen and thought about forgiveness, about grace, about the difference between accepting apologies and requiring change. I thought about gardens that could be restored after periods of neglect, about relationships that could heal when both people were willing to tend them with the same care they'd give to something precious and fragile and worth preserving. The wedding was everything I'd hoped Lucas's wedding would be, small and intimate, and filled with the kind of joy that comes from people who understand that marriage is about creating something beautiful together rather than performing happiness for an audience. Marina wore her grandmother's pearls and a dress that looked perfect against the backdrop of Dorothy's roses. Lucas cried when he saw her walking toward him through the garden where I'd learned to believe in my own worth again. During the reception, as guests danced under lights strung between the trees and shared stories about love that had lasted and love that was just beginning, Lucas found me arranging leftover cake in containers for people to take home. "Mom," he said, "I have something for you." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, the kind that held jewelry rather than business cards or breath mints. Inside, nested in white satin, was Henry's wedding ring. "How did you—" I couldn't finish the question. "I bought it back. Took me 3 months to track it down, cost me more than I sold it for, but I bought it back. It belongs with you, with Dad's memory. Not in some stranger's jewelry collection." I lifted the ring from its cushion, feeling again the weight of 37 years of promises kept, of love that had endured through everything life had thrown at it. It slipped onto my finger beside my own wedding band like it had never been gone, completing something that had felt broken for too long. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me even when I'd given up on myself, for showing me that success isn't about what you acquire, but about who you choose to be when no one's watching, for teaching me that love isn't something you hoard, but something you share until it multiplies." That night, after the last guest had gone home and the dishes were washed and the garden was quiet under a sky full of stars, I sat on Dorothy's porch and wrote in the journal that had carried me through the darkest months of my life. "Sometimes silence is the loudest truth," I wrote. "Sometimes walking away with dignity is more powerful than any words you could speak. Sometimes loving someone means requiring them to earn the privilege of your presence rather than assuming they deserve it simply because you share DNA or history or the habit of calling each other family." I closed the journal and looked up at the sky, where stars were scattered like seeds across the darkness, each one burning with its own light, none of them requiring permission to shine. Inside the house, wedding gifts waited to be opened, evidence of love celebrated, and community witnessed. In the garden, roses bloomed in colors Dorothy had chosen decades ago, proof that beauty planted with intention could outlast the hands that created it. And in my heart, something that had been broken was whole again, not healed back to its original state, but transformed into something stronger, more resilient, more aware of its own value. I was 72 years old, and I was finally learning how to take up exactly the amount of space I deserved. No more, no less, but exactly enough to honor the woman I'd always been and the woman I was still becoming.